In this video, I will continue my discussion on the taxes, but here in the second part, I will focus on the deadweight loss which causes because of the taxes in the market of a good or service. Here you will learn also that how you can calculate deadweight loss numerically and also diagrammatically. There is a time then I will discuss also that how elasticities of demand actually determines the amount of deadweight loss. If the video is going to be longer, then I will discuss elasticities of demand in the next video. So what is deadweight loss? Deadweight loss is the reduction in the total economic surplus, or we can say that it is the loss in the efficiency, which actually results from the adoption of a policy by the government. For example, it can be in form of price control, like price ceiling or price floor, or it can be in form of price subsidy, and it can be in form of taxes. So now we have already discussed the other types of policies, price control and price subsidy. Now I'm going to show you that how taxes are actually causing a deadweight loss by considering the same example of potato market. To compute deadweight loss or loss in efficiency or loss in welfare because of the tax, what we have to do, we have to follow the three steps which I have already mentioned on the when I have discussed the case of subsidy. If you have not seen that video, then I just recommend to go through that video. Okay, so as a first step, what you have to do, you have to calculate the total economic surplus before tax. As a second step, you need to calculate total economic surplus after tax, and then in order to calculate the deadweight loss, you need to calculate the difference between the before and after tax total economic surplus. Let us try to understand it by considering the onion market. And here we are going to analyze that how a tax on the seller actually cause a reduction in the total economic surplus. So as a first step, what we have to do, we have to calculate the total economic surplus before tax. Okay, so in this market you can see that the equilibrium price, which is determined by equating supply and demand, for onion it is equals to $3 per kilogram of onion, and the quantity traded in this market, it is 3 million kilogram of onion. And you can say that this is actually the output level, which can also be known as the social optimum level of output. And at this level of output, both buyers and sellers, they are equally happy with this trade of good. Okay, now in order to calculate the total economic surplus, what we have to do, you know that total economic surplus is a summation of consumer and producer surplus. So there are two methods by which you can calculate the total economic surplus. Either you can just calculate the area of this big blue triangle, or you can calculate the consumer surplus first and then producer and then add them together. So consumer surplus in this diagram is actually the area below this demand curve, and above this market price of $3. So this is the consumer surplus. And what about the producer surplus? Producer surplus is the area of this triangle which is below the market price of $3 and above this supply curve. And so we can say that these are the this is the consumer surplus, and here we have producer surplus. And if we calculate consumer and producer surplus, it is equals to 4.5, and here it is again 4.5. So by summing up both of these consumer and producer surplus, what we have, we will have a total economic surplus which is equals to $9 million per month. And how we have calculated consumer and producer surplus, I am just revising it, that it is the area of the triangle, right angle triangle, which is equals to half multiply by width and to the height of this triangle. Okay, so this is the situation before the imposition of tax, that both consumer and producer, they are enjoying a surplus altogether by an amount of $9 million per month. Okay, so now consider the situation of the same market when there is an imposition of tax of $1 on the seller. In that case, what will happen? We already have discussed that whenever there is a tax on the seller, the supply curve will shift upward by the amount of tax. So if the amount of tax is equals to $1, then this supply curve will shift exactly by $1. As you can see from here, that before it is starting from the from 0, and now it has shifted upward by an amount of $1. Okay, now you can see that the total economic surplus, or the total economic surplus, can be equals to the area of this blue triangle, which is of course smaller than this triangle before tax. So that's why we can just guess that the total economic surplus after tax is going to be lower. Why? Because the new supply curve S plus tax is intersecting the demand curve at a higher point, which can be denoted by, let us suppose, E prime. Okay, so if we calculate the area of this triangle, it is going to be 6.25, and if we want to calculate the producer and consumer surplus, then this time you can see that the price after tax, it is 3.5, which buyer is actually paying in order to buy 1 kilogram of good, and this is actually the price which seller is receiving, but actually the seller has to pay $1 from this price of 3.5. So after paying $1 tax from 3.5, the seller is actually receiving a price which is 2.5. Although he is receiving, he is selling at a price of 3.5 per kilogram, but at that when from this price he also has to pay $1 when he is selling 1 kilogram of onion in the market. Okay, so this is actually the situation, and again, the consumer surplus is area under the demand curve, and producer surplus is the area below the market price and above the supply curve. And you have to calculate the area of these two triangles by using the same formula for area of the triangle, and you will have the consumer surplus equals to 3.125 and producer surplus is 3.125. Okay, so now it's time to calculate the total surplus, which is the summation of consumer and producer surplus. So it is equals to 6.25. In order to see that how much efficiency is lost in this market, what we have to do, we have to take a difference, which is the third step to determine the loss in efficiency. We have to take the difference between the total surplus before tax and total surplus after tax. So the difference between the total economic surplus before and after tax is equals to 9 minus 6.25, which is equals to $2.75 million per month. Okay, so here one point you need to understand here, that tax, whenever government is generating a tax, it means that government is going to use those tax revenues in order to support either transfer that revenues in form of income to the low income group, or either the government is going to use those tax revenues to provide some facilities or some services like health services or cleaning services, law services, or maybe government can use these tax revenues in order to build or construct roads, or to develop the infrastructure in the country. So basically the tax revenues generated by the government is again going to use for the welfare of the people in the economy. Okay, so this is the point which you need to understand here. So in order to analyze how much the government is actually generating taxes by imposing $1 tax on the sellers, let us again consider here that government is imposing $1, right, per kilogram of onion, but here total amount which government is which is traded in this market, it is 2.5. So we can say that total tax revenues, the total tax revenues which government is generating, it is equals to $1 multiplied by the total amount traded in that market, which is 2.5. so for every 1 kilogram government is actually getting $1. So for 2.5 millions of kilogram, the government is going to have 2.5. It will generate $2.5 million per month from a tax of $1. So these are the this is actually we can say the tax revenues generated by the government. Okay, so if the government is again using this 2.5 million for the welfare of people, then it means that it is again coming back to the society. So it will cause we can say that in that case it is actually the benefit of these tax revenues which is equals to 2.5, right? And what is the overall loss in the total economic surplus of $1? It is 2.75. so 2.75 is actually the cost, right? It is the cost of tax, and 2.5 can be considered here as the benefits to the society. So overall the net benefit or net effect of this tax is equals to 2.75 total loss minus the benefit 2.5, so it is going to be 0.25 million dollar, or it is equals to $250,000. Okay, so this is actually the net effect on we can say that $0.25 million is actually the loss or deadweight loss generated because of the taxes. So in this diagram I am just combining the before tax and after tax situation in this onion market. Okay, so before tax you know that it is equals to the area, the total economic surplus is equals to the area of this big triangle which you have calculated. It is $9 million. And after tax what happened, the supply curve, when supply curve shifts upward by the amount of tax, the total economic surplus is going to be lower, and it is equals to the area of this small triangle compared to the previous big triangle. The third party in this market is other than consumer and producer, government, which is generating tax revenue by imposing a tax of $1 at each 1 kilogram of quantity sell in this market. And how can we find the amount of the tax revenues to the government? For that, what we have to do, we have to move we have to take the vertical distance. We have to measure vertical distance in between the new supply curve and the old supply curve. So you will move from the new equilibrium point on the supply curve, the new supply curve, and then move from that point to the old supply curve. So the vertical distance is actually equals to the amount of tax. So this point will gives you a price which is equals to 3.5, and this point on the old supply curve, it will gives you 2.5, which is actually the price which seller is receiving. So the amount of tax can be easily calculated, because sometimes it is not given that what is the amount of tax, and you have to just determine it by using the information given in the diagram. So in that case, what you will do, you will have to take the difference between the price after tax which buyer is paying after tax, okay, after tax, minus the price which seller is receiving after $1 tax, after paying $1 tax. So buyer is actually paying 3.5, right, while the seller is actually receiving how much price? 2.5, right, which is determined by this vertical distance, okay, 2.5, because actually the seller is receiving 3.5, but out of that 3.5 he is paying $1 tax, and after paying $1 tax he is left with price 2.5. So actually seller is receiving 2.5, and so the difference between them is equals to $1, which is the amount of tax. This is one method to find out the tax amount of tax. Okay, so now comes the turn for tax revenues, that how can we calculate the tax revenue. Tax revenue is basically the area of this gray rectangle, and for a rectangle, you know that how can we find the area of a rectangle? It is the product of height of the rectangle to the width of rectangle. So it is equals to 3.5 minus 2.5 into width. But what is the width? It is 2.5. So it is going to be 1 multiplied by 2.5, and the tax revenues are equals to $2.5 million. Okay. So the tax revenues in this market are equals to $2.5 million. And what about the consumer and producer surplus? Diagrammatically, the consumer surplus is actually the area of this triangle, which can be calculated by using this formula. And consumer surplus is equals to what is the height of this triangle? 6 minus 3.5, and what is the width? It is 2.5. So consumers, they are actually enjoying $3.125 billion per month, which is smaller than before tax situation, where the consumers were enjoying a surplus of $4.5 million per month. And what about the producer surplus? Producer surplus is also going to decrease, because producer has to pay a tax of $1. So in that case, the producer surplus can be the area of this triangle, yellow triangle, and again we can calculate the area by using the same triangle area formula. And here the producer surplus, the height of this triangle is equals to 2.5, and the quantity or the width is equals to the quantity traded in this market. and it is also 2.5. So when we solve it, we will have a value of producer surplus, which is exactly equals to the consumer surplus. Okay, so there is a reduction in both consumer and the producer surplus. And what about this gray area? This is the tax revenues to the government. Okay, and both consumer and producer, they are actually participating in this tax revenues, because half of the tax is paid by the consumer and half of the tax is paid by the producer. But basically this tax was imposed on the seller. Okay, now and why both consumer and producer, they are equally sharing this tax of $1, because this supply curve is unit elastic. So consumer, whenever the supply curve is unit elastic, producer can share the burden of tax equally with the consumers by just increasing the price of the good by the half amount of the tax. Okay, now what is this small triangle? You know that it is actually the deadweight loss, or the loss in efficiency. Here the deadweight loss can be calculated by calculating the area of this small triangle, which is actually showing that the market can produce and sell 3 million kilograms of onions, but the market is basically just trading 2.5. So the difference between the quantities before tax and after tax, or the difference between the social optimum quantity and the quantity after tax, after the implication of the policy, is actually the width of this small triangle, and the height of this small triangle for the deadweight loss is always equals to the tax or subsidy, or whatever is the policy implication by the government, in form of price ceiling, in form of price floor, or in form of sometimes price subsidy. When we calculate the area of this small triangle, which is the deadweight loss or loss in efficiency, it will gives us a value of 0.25 million. So because of the imposition of $1 tax in this onion market, the overall loss in efficiency is equals to $0.25 million per month. So this is the way how we can compute and understand the changes in the consumer and the producer surplus after the imposition of tax, and how we can compute and understand diagrammatically and also numerically the amount of loss in welfare, or the amount of deadweight loss. You are asked to calculate the total revenue before and after tax. So total revenue before tax. Revenues are always from the seller's perspective, and it is actually equals to the price into quantity, right? And diagrammatically, it is the area of the rectangle. So before tax, the total revenue can be calculated as this one is the initial or social optimal. So it is actually the area of this rectangle. Okay, the price was it was 3, and the quantity sold it was also 3. So the total revenues to the seller it is 9 million dollar per month. And what about the total revenues after tax? After tax, what we have to do, how can we calculate the total revenue to the seller? The total revenues are going to be calculated by calculating the area from here. The price which seller is receiving after paying tax, it is 2.5, and how much he is actually selling, he is selling only 2.5. So the area of this rectangle will give you the revenues for seller after tax. And in this case the revenues after tax, revenues after total revenues to the seller after tax, it is equals to the price 2.5 multiplied by the quantity which is also 2.5, and again it is actually the area of this yellow rectangle. Okay, so it is going to be 6.25 million dollar. So this is the way how you can calculate the revenues for seller before and after tax. I hope that you have enjoyed this topic of taxes and the amount of the deadweight loss. If you like this video, then don't forget to thumbs up and share with your friends. Please subscribe to my channel and don't forget to press the bell icon so you will receive the notification for my latest video.